Hey guys, what's going on? My name is Bram and welcome to another Flutter SDK tutorial. Now the topic for today will be JSON. We'll learn how to create local JSON files, how to read those JSON files, how to write to those JSON files, and in general, how to use JSON with Flutter. Now I got a little preview application for you guys. So this application prints out the content of a file if the file exists. If the file does not exist, we can add key value pairs to a new file, so we create a new file. And if the file exists already, we just append to that file. So let's take a look how that works. In here, we can fill in a key value, something like soda. In here, we can add a value, something like Sprite. And if we then press this button, add key value pair, we should see the file content printed out over here. So let's take a look. And that worked wonderfully, that worked fine. So without further ado, I'll be creating a new project now and I'll come back to you guys in a minute. Alright, so like usual, I've already created a little bit of boilerplate just to get the video length a little bit shorter because I don't type quite as quickly as those other developers, and watching me, code this layout would not be that interesting. But let's go over it really quick. If you want a more detailed look, it will be on my GitHub page as well. So let's take a look. So we got a basic material app. The home property has a new home. Home is the stateful widget, which has a state, of course, which is called home state, which already has two class variables, one called key input controller and one called value input controller. Now both of these are text editing controllers. So the first one, key input controller, is going to be used for filling in key values for our JSON objects in here, and the other one is going to be used, so value input controller is going to be used to give a value to the key and just to handle that text field. All right, so in here we just dispose the key input controllers, the key input controller and the value input controller, because that's just good practice. And our build method looks a little bit like this. We got a scaffold with a standard app bar. We got a body with a column, with some widgets, some padding, just a normal text widget to display the file content, title. Then we have a placeholder where we will be showing the actual content of the JSON file, some more padding, another title, and in here we have our two text fields with a button to actually trigger adding or writing to our JSON file. All right, so that was boring enough. Let's now start with the actual coding. So for this, we actually will need some more class variables. So let's start with those. We will need a file, and let's call this JSON file. We will need a directory. Let's call this dir for directory. We will need a string file name, and we can actually assign this already. So the file name is basically just going to be the name of our JSON file. So let's call this something like my JSON file.json. Don't forget the JSON extension, of course, if you're using JSON. Do we need something else? We do. We actually also need a boolean to keep track of whether the file actually exists or not, because writing to a file that does not exist does not make any sense, of course. So let's assign that to false initially. And do we need something else? Let me take a look. Yeah, of course, we also need a map. String to hold the content, the converted content from our JSON file. Now, JSON files can hold strings for key values and integers, doubles, strings, and a lot of other stuff as values. But we're just going to use strings for this tutorial, but be aware that you can also use something like dynamic here if we're using something else than strings, of course. Now, we have two errors here because file and directory are classes that Dart doesn't know at the moment, or this Dart file doesn't know at the moment. We actually need to import Dart.io for this. We will also need to import Dart convert to work with JSON and to convert JSON to maps and to convert maps to JSON. And we will actually need one more thing. We will need to add an external plugin, external library called pet provider, or plugin, not a library, to get the pet where we will store our JSON file. So for example, in Windows and in Mac, you have your documents folder. You have something very similar in iOS and Android. And to get the actual path to those folders, we need this plugin. So if you're unfamiliar with plugins, basically you just copy this. You go to pubspec.yaml and you paste it under the dependencies. Now, of course, if there's a newer version out, then feel free to use a newer version, because I doubt that it's going to change a lot. But if you're running into some errors because of this, try to switch to an earlier version, or maybe even this version, to see if that works for you. Now, after that, if you're using Visual Studio Code, IntelliJ, or Android Studio, and you press Ctrl S, then so you save your file, then Flutter will automatically fetch or get that package, that plugin, into your project. But if you're just using the terminal, you should use Flutter. You should run Flutter packages get, and that will get the pet provider package into your project. All right. So assuming you did all of that, we can now import this package, which is called package pet provider / pet provider.dart. And now we are done with the imports finally. Awesome. So we now got our class variables. Let's now create some functions. We'll need two functions actually. One will return a file. We're going to make a function called createFile, which will take a map string, which is going to be the content that you want to write to the file that you're creating. Let's just keep this empty for now and worry about it in a minute. And we also need another function called, or we're going to call it at least, write to file, which will take a string, if I can type it, string key, and we're going to call that key, and we also need a value, because we are going to write keys and values to the JSON file, of course. Awesome. So let's not worry about this, or actually let's first worry about our init state function. So let's override our init state function, void init state, and let's type out super.init state, of course. And now we actually still do not have our directory where we are going to store our JSON file. But remember, we just installed this plugin, which will give us the directory. Now we want to store our JSON file in the documents directory. So the function that our plugin provides for that is get application documents directory. You can also store your JSON file in get temporary directory, but I believe that the temporary directory gets deleted every time that you close the application, which is not ideal if you want to store data for longer, for in between sessions, of course. So for our tutorial, we're going to be using get application documents directory. Now this function will return a future, which means that it is asynchronous. Now we're going to use the .then syntax. So if you're unfamiliar with this, we're calling this function, then we're calling then. So then, when it's available, we are getting a directory back, which like this basically behaves like a function. And here in this body of this function, we have the directory available to us, right? But this will happen asynchronously. If I would say print out something like, hey, in here, then it's possible that this gets executed before this, because we're using the then syntax, if that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, you know, I already, like, if you're following along with this, then I hope that you already have some experience with asynchronous programming. So if you do not have experience with it, please look it up, look some other tutorials for it, and come back to this tutorial once you're done. All right, so now we can actually assign the directory to our class variable called directory, of course, called dir, this, this, and we can start creating our file now. So we can now say JSON file equals new file, and new file, the file constructor wants a path from us, and the path is basically going to be our directory.path. So directory.path will return a string with the path to the documents directory. Now we're going to say plus / plus file name. So what we're doing here is we are concatenating our paths to the directory with the paths to the file, to the actual file. All right, so I think that is pretty clear. Now, of course, we should also check whether the file actually exists, because writing to a file that does not exist does not make any sense, of course. Excuse me. So file exists equals JSON file dot exists. And now we have two options actually. We can use a asynchronous function, so that's this, the exists function, or we can use the synchronous function called existSync. Now usually you would use the asynchronous function, of course, because you don't want to be waiting, because IO can take some time, of course, but just to keep this tutorial short, we're using synchronous methods only from now on. So keep in mind, if we're using a production application, it most of the time makes sense to use asynchronous IO instead of synchronous IO. But for this tutorial, we'll be using synchronous IO. All right, so now we know whether the file exists or not. So we can now say, if the file exists, then we're going to say this.setState file content equals JSON.decode, and this might be unfamiliar for you, but just hang in there for a moment. JSON file.read a string synchronous. All right, so let's take a look at what we actually did here. So if our file exists, then we are setting the state, and the reason for this will become why we use setState and why we don't just use this will become clear in a minute. So we set the state. So our file content, this map, will be equal to JSON.decode our JSON file .read a string synchronous. So what we're doing is actually we're reading our JSON file and we are decoding it to a map that Dart can use, because a plain JSON object is not usable in Dart, so we have to decode it. And we can use this JSON .decode function because we imported Dart convert the Dart convert library. All right, so I think that makes sense as well. So else, if the file does not exist, or actually we don't need an else for this one. Now the reason why I used set state here is because we want to this might change, and we actually also want to print this out on the screen. So like you can see over here, we have a placeholder for file content. So let's actually fill in that placeholder. So in here, in this text widget, we will be pasting file content .toString. So now it should make sense why we are using this .setState, because we want to update this widget whenever this file content variable changes, of course. Awesome. Now we can start creating our create file and write to file function. So let's start off with the write to file function, which should not be that difficult. So let's give us some feedback in the console that we are writing to a file. Now we should have our content that we want to write to the file in a map. So it's going to be a map with the key and the value string, because our arguments, of course. Let's call this content equals a map key value. Now, if the file exists, then we can just write to the file, right? We can just print out, okay, the file exists. Or actually, we can actually not just like write to the file, or we can, but that makes it difficult. But what we actually should do is first get the content that is in the JSON file, then merge that content with the content that we want to add to the JSON file, and then write it back to the JSON file. So if that sounds complicated, just hang tight, we'll get through it. It's not that difficult. So we'll create a new map, string, and let's call this JSON file content. That's going to be equal to JSON.decode, and we're going to decode our JSON file, of course. And now we have our data that was in the JSON file into a nice map, right? Into a nice map that Dart can use. Now to actually merge JSON file contents and contents, we can use JSON file contents dot add all, and here we type the map that we want to merge with it. So this is going to be contents, and now we have the complete, like all of the content that we want to write out to our JSON file. So what we can now do is JSON file dot write as string synchronous, JSON dot encode, because like, you know, Dart cannot read, Dart cannot actually use plain JSON objects, and JSON can actually not use plain maps from Dart. So we also need to decode, we also need to encode our JSON map, our Dart map, to a proper JSON object. So we use JSON.encode, and as a value we just give the Dart map that we want to encode. So this is going to be JSON file content. Awesome. I hope you guys are still following along, because it's not going as smooth as planned. So else, if the file does not exist, then we're going to keep it simple. We're just going to say print file does not exist. And we're just going to like outsource this work to create the create file function, and the content argument is going to be the same. It's still just going to be this, right? So what we're doing is we're outsourcing it so we don't have to create a really large block of code here. So jumping to the create file function, which also isn't that difficult to write. First of all, let's get some feedback. Creating file. Let's now create a new file. So file, new file. And it's going to be the same path as we used here, of course. And now we can say file.create synchronous, and that will actually create the file. That will actually create the file for us on the device, right? So now we can say file exists. I'm sorry about that. File exists equals true. And we can say write. I'm sorry. What do we do now? Okay, now we can say file.write a string synchronous Json.encode, and we're just going to encode our Dart map again to a JSON object, and then we are going to return file. Now the reason why I'm actually creating a new file here instead of using this JSON file, this class variable, is because if you're like creating a bigger application, it makes sense to create these functions in another file, in another Dart file, that is. And that would mean that you do not have this as a class variable available to you. So that's the reason for that. But for this, you could actually also just say, you could also just skip this and say JSON file.create synchronous and do the same for this and this. But we're not going to do that because we want to keep our project a little bit modular at least. So yeah. And now we're actually finished. Let's think about this, because we're returning a file in the create file function, but we're actually never let's think about this. We actually never use this value that we returned. So let's delete this. Let's make this void. Let's make this even more modular. So we're giving it the contents as an argument. But we should actually also give it the directory there, and we should also give it the file name, of course, just to keep this function a little bit more modular, so you can use it in other files, of course. So we will need to adjust this create file here in our write to file methods. So the directory will just be there, and the file name will be file name. All right, awesome. Now this function can be used outside of this file as well. And I think we're finished now, actually. We should also actually make this more modular, but I'm just going to leave that as a test to you guys because it's not that difficult. So let's test this application. Now, I think that we will have to fully restart for this to work. So in Visual Studio Code, press Ctrl-Shift-B and type in Flutter Restart. You know, if we're using IntelliJ or Android Studio or the command line, use the appropriate command, of course. So let's take a look. Does this work? So remember, in the first text field, we give in the key, so something like soda. In here we fill in the value, which could be something like Sprite. Then we say add key value pair. And does that work? That did not work. Why did that not work? Let's save this again. Let's try to restart it again because I feel like this should work. Really feel like this should work. Or no, it does not work because in our write to file, we actually also need to set the state, of course. So in here, we should also say this.setState, right? Because our file contents change. So our file content is changing. Not our JSON file content, but our actually file content is changing, or we should change that. So file content equals JSON.decode. And in here we say JSON file dot read as string synchronous. So one more time because I'm just going crazy here. We need to set the state for the file content because we're displaying it here, of course, and we need to re-render the widget whenever the file content, we want to change the file content, and the file content will be equal to our decoded JSON file, right? So let's now restart this application. Let's do a full restart again. And let's say, what did I do? Soda, Sprite, add key value pair. Still not working. All right, so I'm actually kind of embarrassed for what I actually forgot because it's so simple. But I already told you I'm going crazy here. But we actually forgot to add our write to file function to our raised button, right? So we should actually add write to file here, and write to file takes a string of key, a key and a value, which will be in our input controllers or text editing controllers. Key input controller dots text and value input controller dot text. Now let's save this. Let's full restart this. And let's try this again, hoping that it works now. Soda, Sprite. Awesome, it works. Now let's do something else. Another key. Let's say Sprite. I think, do they have diet Sprite? I think they do. So diet Sprite, and that concatenates it to the JSON object, of course. Now JSON objects have to have like keys, non-matching keys. So if I would overwrite this key with something else like diet Sprite dot dot dot, then that would overwrite that previous entry, of course. So that was the video for today. Really hope you guys enjoyed it. I know it was a little bit hectic. I did a lot of things, like I was going crazy a little bit, but I still hope that it was easy enough to follow along, and I hope I see you guys in the next tutorial. See you guys later.